The morning of June 21, 1944, on the banks of the Svir River, did not begin with the usual roar of cannon fire, but with a frightening, ringing silence hanging over the cold water. Fog, thick and sticky like milk, slowly descended from the coastal cliffs, concealing the opposite bank, where the enemy lay hidden in granite crevices and concrete pillboxes. 12 brave men stood at the water's edge, trembling not from the morning chill, but from the extreme tension of the moment that was to change the course of history on the northern front. Their task seemed like madness, bordering on a guaranteed end to their lives. To cross the icy, turbulent river several hundred meters wide, under the gaze of thousands of invisible eyes, to draw fire upon themselves. They pushed rafts and boats before them, but there were no weapons or ammunition in them, only effigies. Mannequins in soldiers' uniforms stuffed with straw and rags. This was one of the most daring and theatrical productions of World War II, where the price of admission was life, and the stage was the turbulent current of a Karelian river. As soon as the rafts pushed off, the fog tore apart. The opposite bank, until then silent, suddenly erupted in an avalanche of fire, revealing its carefully camouflaged positions. Finnish machine gunners and artillerymen, mistaking the dummies for a real landing party, unleashed the full might of their defenses upon them, unaware that every shot they fired was being mapped by Soviet spotters. This episode, which became a legendary feint, was just a tiny spark from which a flame erupted, engulfing the entire Karelian Isthmus and southern Karelia, marking the beginning of the end of the 3-year blockade of the North and Finland's withdrawal from the war. To understand why these 12 men found themselves in the icy water of June 44, it is necessary to rewind time and look at a map that resembled a labyrinth created by a mad giant more than a battlefield. Karelia is not just a territory, it is a geological nightmare for any attacking army. There are no familiar fields where tank wedges can deploy, no flat horizons for maneuver. It is a land of 1,000 lakes, bottomless swamps, and most importantly, granite. The land here is covered with boulders the size of houses, and the forests are so dense that visibility drops to a dozen meters. Since 1941, when the front line stabilized, this area had become an impregnable fortress. The enemy, using the features of the terrain, created a defensive system here that could rival the best fortifications in Europe in its complexity and impregnability. The Finnish army, intimately familiar with every rock and every path, had literally merged with this landscape. They didn't just build pillboxes, they gnawed into the granite cliffs, turning them into firing points that could not be suppressed by conventional artillery. Shells hitting the rock did not destroy the shelter, but merely carved out fountains of stone chips. The situation by the summer of 1944 was paradoxical. In the south, Soviet troops were already liberating Ukraine and preparing for a thrust into Europe, but here, in the north, 300 kilometers from Leningrad, the enemy still stood on the same lines as 3 years ago. The second largest city of the Soviet Union, having just survived a terrible blockade, was still under threat from the north. The railway connecting Murmansk with the center of the country, the main artery through which Allied supplies flowed, remained cut or under constant shelling. Geopolitical necessity dictated harsh conditions. One could not march on Berlin, leaving an entire enemy army lurking in the Karelian forests behind one's back. It was not just about pushing back the border, it was about delivering a powerful blow to knock Finland out of the war, severing its alliance with Germany. But how to break through defenses that had been built for 3 years and reinforced by nature itself? How to pass where tanks sink in swamps and infantry breaks against rocks? The answer to this question lay in a plain where strategy clashed with the crude matter of stone and water. Preparations for the offensive, known as the Vyborg to Petrozavodsk operation, were carried out with the meticulousness more characteristic of architects than generals. The command of the Leningrad and Karelian fronts understood. A frontal assault here was tantamount to suicide. It was necessary to create such a concentration of fire and metal that it could grind granite itself. In the forests, deep in the rear, Soviet sappers built exact replicas of enemy fortifications, on which assault groups practiced every movement until it was automatic. They learned not just to shoot, but to climb sheer cliffs with full gear, to force water obstacles, to interact with tanks in conditions where equipment could only move along narrow clearings. This was a war of engineers. It was necessary to lay roads through bogs, build corduroy roads over which heavy Klim Voroshilov and Iosif Stalin tanks could pass. Thousands of people felled forests, paved swamps, creating infrastructure for a strike where the enemy considered the terrain impassable. However, the external visible layer of preparation concealed a profound psychological and tactical conflict. The Finnish command, led by Marshal Mannerheim, harbored a dangerous illusion. They believed that the Soviet Union, exhausted by the war in the south, would not expend vast resources on storming the Karelian fortified region. Their intelligence reported troop movements, but the scale of the impending strike remained underestimated. Finnish soldiers, sitting in their granite dugouts, believed in the impregnability of the VT line, Vamalsu Taipale, and the VKT line, Vyborg Kuparsari Taipale. These defense lines consisted of concrete anti-tank obstacles stretching to the horizon, minefields so dense that there were several mines per square meter, and multi-tiered firing points. The psychology of the Finnish soldier was simple and strong. He was defending his home, his land, and this motive made him an incredibly resilient opponent. But by that time, the Soviet soldier had developed a different motivation, a cold fury and the professionalism of a victor who had passed through Stalingrad and Kursk. It was a clash of two different types of military spirit, the tenacity of a forest hunter against the crushing power of an industrial war machine. On June 10, 1944, illusions were shattered. The artillery barrage that began on the Karelian Isthmus had no equal in the history of northern wars. More than 200 guns and mortars were deployed per kilometer of front. The roar was so deafening that it could be heard in Helsinki. But the most terrifying things were happening at the front line. Soviet artillery employed a new tactic. Fire was not directed at areas, but precisely at identified concrete pillboxes and rock shelters. Heavy howitzers methodically pounded the granite, turning it into rubble. Aviation, whose air superiority was absolute, ironed out the trenches. The earth trembled, ancient pine trees were uprooted like matches. For Finnish soldiers, accustomed to positional warfare, this hell was a shock. Stone shelters, which seemed eternal, collapsed, burying their garrisons. The peculiarity of warfare in rocks manifested itself here with full brutality. When a shell hit a rock, a secondary damage effect occurred. Thousands of stone fragments scattered with the lethal force of shrapnel, inflicting severe injuries even on those not affected by the blast wave. The breakthrough of the first line of defense took only 24 hours. What had been built for years was overcome in a single day. Soviet tanks, equipped with special mine trawls, advanced through minefields without stopping. The infantry, having learned from the bitter experience of the Winter War, did not cluster in lowlands but moved in bounds, utilizing terrain folds. However, as they pushed deeper, resistance intensified. The second line of defense was even stronger. This is where battles began, which historians would later call the Battle in the Stone Jungles. Tanks often proved useless in narrow defiles between rocks, becoming easy targets for Faust patrons, which Germany had begun to hastily supply to its ally. The war fragmented into thousands of localized skirmishes. Assault groups with flamethrowers and explosives approached pillboxes in dead zones. This was work of jewelers' precision and monstrous risk. The flamethrower operator had to approach within firing range, 20 to 30 meters, while under crossfire. If he succeeded, a jet of flame into the embrasure put an end to the pillbox's resistance. At the same time, on another sector of the front, on the Svir River, where our narrative began, its own drama was unfolding. Here, the main enemy was water. The crossing of the Svir became a masterpiece of engineering thought and tactical cunning. The commander of the Karelian front, Kirill Meretskov, understood that simply swimming across the river under fire was impossible. It was here that the clever trick with the false landing was employed. While the Finns fired at rafts with dummies, Soviet artillery pinpointed all their firing positions. The subsequent strike was devastating. But it wasn't enough to suppress the enemy with fire. Equipment also needed to be transported. And here, Lend-Lease Ford amphibious vehicles came into play, and, even more importantly, amphibious tanks and self-propelled ferries. For the first time in the history of northern warfare, such a large water barrier was overcome on the fly, without days of preparation for bridgeheads. Soldiers landed on a bank where not only the forest, but it seemed the very earth was burning. Parallel to the military actions, a profound internal conflict developed in the minds of the Finnish leadership. President Risto Ryti and Marshal Mannerheim found themselves trapped by their own decisions. Germany demanded that they hold out to the last, promising air and weapons support in exchange for signing a pact prohibiting Finland from concluding a separate peace. This was a choice between national suicide for the sake of an ally who was already collapsing himself and an attempt to save the remnants of sovereignty. In Helsinki, they understood. The Soviet offensive was not just a military operation, it was a death sentence. If the Red Army reached the capital, Finland's independence would become history. Each day of resistance on the Karelian Isthmus was bought at the cost of enormous losses, depleting the already small gene pool of the nation. On the other hand, violating obligations to Berlin threatened the cessation of grain and weapons supplies, without which the army would not have lasted a week. This was the tragedy of a small state, caught between the millstones of great powers, but having made its choice on the wrong side. The key turning point, the moment of transformation of the entire campaign, was the capture of Vyborg on June 20th. The fortress city, a symbol of Finnish defense, fell surprisingly quickly. This caused shock. It seemed the front had collapsed. However, it was precisely after the fall of Vyborg that the fiercest and bloodiest battle of the entire Northern War began. The Battle of Tali-Ihantala. Here, the terrain presented an ideal landscape for defense. Narrow passages between lakes, commanding heights, dense forest. The Finns pulled all available reserves here, including a tank division. German aviation transferred a group of aces and dive bombers. Soviet troops, advancing on a narrow patch, encountered an unprecedented density of fire. It was a massacre where metal melted and the earth turned into a lunar landscape. Tank battles were fought at pistol-shot range. Soviet heavy tanks crushed anti-tank guns with their tracks, and Finnish soldiers with Panzerfausts hunted them from behind every boulder. In this chaos, the paradox of war manifested itself. The tactical victory and defense at Tali-Ihantala, the Finns managed to stop the Soviet breakthrough deep into the country, turned into a strategic defeat for Finland. Yes, they held the line, but resources were completely exhausted. They no longer had men to close the gaps, no shells, no fuel. While the Soviet Union could bring in new reserves, Finland had played its last trump card. It was at this moment, in the smoke of burning forests near Ihantala, that the realization of the inevitable came. The war had to end immediately, at any cost, while there was someone to negotiate with. The military success in holding the front paradoxically became not a springboard for continuing the fight, but the only argument for starting negotiations for surrender on relatively acceptable terms. At the same time, events on the Svir front developed rapidly. After successfully forcing the river, the troops of the Karelian front began a deep encirclement of the enemy group. The liberation of Petrozavodsk became the culmination of this part of the operation. On June 28th, ships of the Onega military flotilla landed troops directly in the city's port. The enemy, fearing encirclement, began a hasty retreat, abandoning the city practically without a fight. The picture that met the liberators was depressing, yet at the same time inspiring hope. Destroyed bridges, burning buildings, but most importantly, residents who emerged from camps and basements to greet their own. The capture of Petrozavodsk meant the complete restoration of control over the strategically important Kirov railway line. Now quote from Murmansk could freely reach the center of the country. The northern _0_ that had choked the country for 3 years was released. August and early September of 1944 became a time of diplomatic agony and the final chords of hostilities. In Finland, a change of power occurred. President Ruti resigned, his place was taken by Mannerheim, who did not consider himself bound by Ruti's personal promises to Ribbentrop. This was an elegant, though cynical, political maneuver that allowed Helsinki to break off relations with Berlin. On September 4th, the Finnish command issued an order for a ceasefire. Soviet troops ceased fire exactly 1 day later, on September 5th. The ensuing silence was deafening. Soldiers, who just yesterday had been looking at each other through sights, emerged from their trenches. There were no fraternizations, only wariness and fatigue. The war on this sector ended, but a new, no less complex chapter began. The Lapland War, where the Finns were to turn their weapons against their former allies, the Germans, to expel them from their territory in accordance with the armistice terms. The Moscow Armistice, signed on September 19, 1944, drew a line under the bloodshed. The terms were harsh, but not humiliating to the point of destroying statehood. The border was moved even further than in 1940. Finland paid huge reparations in goods, which, oddly enough, would later help it build a powerful industry for Soviet orders. The Petsamo region with its nickel mines went to the USSR. But most importantly, the Soviet Union secured its northwestern borders without the need to occupy all of Finland and wage a long partisan war there. The lessons of this campaign resonate through the decades with frightening relevance. The Battle for Karelia showed that even the most powerful fortifications and the most difficult terrain cannot stop an army with overwhelming technical superiority and competent logistics. It was a triumph of indirect strategy and engineering support. We see how nature, initially an ally of the defenders, turns into a trap when the enemy learns to use its features against them. But a deeper lesson lies in the plane of geopolitics and humanity. Finland, having walked along the brink of complete annihilation, managed to find the strength to acknowledge reality and make a painful but salvific turnaround. The ability to stop in time, to sacrifice ambitions for the survival of the nation. This is a lesson in political realism rarely found in history. The relationships built on the ruins of this war became a unique example of how mortal enemies can become pragmatic neighbors. Today, if you walk through the forests of the Karelian Isthmus or the banks of the Svir, you will see scars on the earth that have not healed even after 80 years. Trenches carved into the rocks are overgrown with blueberries and moss. Concrete pillboxes, blown up by sappers, resemble ancient megaliths, monuments of a vanished civilization. Rusty barbed wire has grown into tree trunks, becoming part of the living flesh of the forest. Here, amidst the silence of the pine forest, it is difficult to imagine the hell that raged in the summer of 44th. But just approach the water, to that very spot on the Svir where 12 heroes pushed their rafts with dummies, and you will feel the cold breath of history. The water still flows, indifferent to human passions, hiding shells and shrapnel at the bottom. The circle has closed. Beginning with icy water and cunning, this story led to a peace that was also, in its own way, a cold water compromise. Sober, harsh, but necessary for life. Those 12 brave men who crossed the river did not just follow an order. They crossed the line separating endless war from the beginning of a difficult path to peace. Their feet, like the feet of hundreds of thousands of others who remained in the Karelian land, became the foundation of the reality in which the northern border ceased to be a front line. And in this rustle of the wind in the tops of the Karelian pines, one hears not only the echo of explosions, but also a quiet reminder of the price that must be paid for every meter of peace on this harsh, granite land.